Hi, this is lecture 2, and it's about dog origins and the archaeology of dog-human relationships. So in the first lecture, I talked a bit about this course and the disciplines that are a part of it. And I let you know that this is primarily a cultural anthropology course, right? I'm a cultural anthropologist. But that we will also be engaging both with some of the other subfields within anthropology and as well with some other closely related disciplines. So this unit and this lecture are really the place in the course where you will engage the most with the other subfields of anthropology, especially archaeology and biological anthropology. So the things you read for this week are all by archaeologists and biological anthropologists, and a lot of the subjects that we're talking about are really sort of in their wheelhouse. So I think this is a really interesting complement to a lot of the sort of more social science kind of cultural anthropology stuff that we'll be doing for a lot of the other units in the course. So for this week, again, I had you read a few things, and I also had you watch a couple of films. And these films, I think, really sort of provide that overview of sort of the arc of dog origins and the archaeological and genetic evidence that we have for sort of when dogs arose and in what context. And a lot of that information demonstrates really clearly what I started talking about last week, which is that dog and human evolution are really closely tied and interrelated in a lot of ways, right? So we know that dogs were the first animals domesticated by humans, and that both physically and socially, there's all kinds of synergy there, that the ways that dogs evolved and the ways that humans evolved owe something to those sort of interactions. So it's sort of a mutual process of coming into being. Dog origins then, in terms of, again, what the archaeological and genetic evidence provide, goes back at least 15,000 years. There certainly is good evidence for that 15,000 year time span. And as one of the pieces you read for this week demonstrates, it could be considerably longer than that. So archaeology, like any other science, is constantly in process, constantly shifting. So the fact that those dates are under question and perhaps moving is just a sign of ongoing work in the field and new discoveries and new analyses and new interpretations of the evidence that is provided. What the evidence, again, to date does show is that dogs originated in Eurasia through processes of the domestication of the gray wolf. What the sort of framework mostly suggests is likely in terms of what that process looked like is that wolves and humans shared hunting grounds and therefore were competing for some of the same game. And through that close proximity, processes of domestication of the wolf sort of were initiated. And again, there's sort of evidence for a few different mechanisms that led to that domestication. Part of it is that more docile wolves tended to be selected by humans for various uses, and that over time selecting for those more docile wolves led to the creation of the dog. Or there's also some sort of evidence that that process was partly the wolves choosing the humans as much as humans choosing the wolves, in the sense that some wolves in particular, perhaps those without an existing sort of social group of other wolves, made use of sort of the outskirts of human encampments as a source of food, right? So understood that if they could get closer to humans, there were food sources to be had there. So between that sort of process of perhaps some part of humans choosing wolves and some part of wolves choosing humans, the process that was set in motion was one that led to the domestication of the dog, again, at least 15,000 years ago, perhaps longer. So the two films that you're watching really provide sort of an overview. I strongly recommend that you watch both of them and understand them to be sort of a base for a lot of what we're talking about in this unit. So that is both the Nova film, which is called Dog Tales, and The Brief History of Dogs, which again sort of give you that sort of broad sense of what we know so far about sort of how dogs emerged and where they came from. So then, in addition to the films, I had you read a few things. And again, these readings look a little different than a lot of the other readings that we'll be doing for the course because they're coming out of particular academic fields. So the Perry et al. Is written by archaeologists. So it looks more like a scientific article than some of the cultural anthropology articles do or will when you read them. But I wanted to include it because, again, I think it gives you a good sense of the ways that archaeologists go about sort of thinking about these kinds of questions, and the kind of research and evidence that they make use of to try to, again, put some kinds of parameters on the trajectory of the dog. So what Perry et al. Are talking about here is the ways that both dogs and humans moved over time, particularly in their dispersal into the Americas. And again, they're sort of working to look at what we already know and to raise some questions about that date of about 15,000 years ago. What Perry et al. Ultimately suggest in this article is that there's evidence that that timeline is considerably longer, and that in fact that wolves were first domesticated into dogs in Siberia around 23,000 years ago. So the graphic they provided, which I have here on the slide, shows sort of the branches across that sort of timeline of the domestication, the process of wolves becoming dogs, and they're looking at the much earlier moment around 23,000 years ago, where they suggest, in fact, before people dispersed into the Americas, that dogs may have already been domesticated. So what they're suggesting is that the first people to cross into the Americas may have already had dogs and may have already had those dogs with them. So they may have essentially brought those dogs with them. And that is a sort of new chapter of this story in terms of what we already know about dogs. One of the questions that Perry et al. Raised, which I think is an important one for all of this work that we're looking at this week, is that in fact precisely dating dog origins is challenging, because what we're talking about is a sort of shift from wolves to dogs over time. There's not one clear dividing line. In the film, for example, you saw the work with, for example, skulls from prehistoric wolves and dogs, and sort of how the shape of the skull changed over time. But clearly it's a gradation, right? It's not a clear black and white. So, in fact, wolves and dogs sort of overlapped at a certain point during this process. And therefore, looking at the evidence, it's sometimes difficult, or there's questions around how to decide whether the evidence fits into the category of wolf or the category of dog. So that makes precise dating more difficult. But again, Perry et al. Are raising this question and hypothesizing that the timeline of the dog is historically deeper than we had thought before, and may in fact go back as far as 23,000 years ago. You also read the Mori and Jaeger, which again is archaeologists thinking about dogs. In this case, this is less about sort of the evolutionary timeline of the domestication of the dog, and more about dog-human relationships over time. In particular, in this article, they're looking at one kind of phenomenon that is well represented in the archaeological record, and that's cases of people and dogs being buried together, right? And again, here again, there's a question about, well, how do we classify something as a quote-unquote burial? Right, so they raise the issue that we have the remains of dogs in the archaeological record. It's not always completely clear whether that was, for example, disposing of the corpse of a dog that died versus a sort of meaningful and purposeful burial, similar to what we might find for a human, right? One that demonstrates that dog had a role in that community, for example, and was being honored through their burial. So there's some sort of gray areas there, again, about how to classify the the ways that these dog remains appear when they're excavated, and how to analyze what the meanings might be there. But certainly, there's plenty of evidence in the archaeological record of at least some of those burials that seem to be not dissimilar from the ways that humans are buried. For example, there are cases of dogs buried with grave goods, again, similar to the ways that human graves in that region look. Maury and Jaeger are really looking across the whole world at the many, many instances of dog and human joint burials. They occur, again, in all regions of the world and across a very long time span. So we know that this is a phenomenon, right? There's lots of instances of it. And again, they're sort of trying to make sense of if we look at all these cases in the aggregate, what can we say about dog-human relationships, or what these particular kinds of items tell us about dog-human relationships. The earliest example goes back to around 14,000 years ago. And that example, again, sort of sets the parameter, but there are much more recent examples as well. And we certainly know that there are contemporary examples, right? People bury pets now. So across that entire timeline, what can we make of this act of burying dogs? So what Maury and Jaeger sort of come to in their analysis is that on the one hand, there's a lot of variability, right? The burials don't all look the same. So clearly we're not going to try to suggest that there's one meaning there. But they do seem to suggest that there's sort of a range of varying degrees to which dogs and humans were in that moment and in that space considered to be sort of parallel beings. So certainly some of these burials seem to suggest that dogs were being treated as beings with sort of social significance not dissimilar from humans, right? So some were buried in ways that suggested that they could have been considered family members, or perhaps also guardians or companions for the afterlife. So there may have been that sort of religious significance. In other cases, there's a suggestion that they may have been sacrificed, that indeed dogs may have been put to death at the moment of a human death, right? So again, it's not suggesting that all of this is about, treating dogs like humans per se, but there certainly is evidence of a significant and lasting set of relationships between dogs and people. So their sort of conclusions overall is that if we look at all of this evidence, it suggests that dogs in places around the world and for a very long period of time have been regarded as spiritually significant beings. That is, beings worthy of the sort of ritual act of a purposeful burial. And that tendency to view dogs in that way, again, is sort of notably universal, right? That it transcends time and space as well as ethnic and religious boundaries. That it's found in disparate sites around the world and with a tremendous range in terms of the timing, the date. So they sort of land on this idea that although we can't always understand what dog and human joint burials meant in that exact moment, if we look at all this evidence in the aggregate, right, as a body of evidence, we can certainly suggest that this practice was widespread and tells us something about the importance of the social relationships between dogs and people over time. And the final article that you read, which is by Shipman, who is a biological anthropologist, is really about human evolution, but is about the place of relationships with animals in human evolution. So Shipman is really talking about what defines humanness in terms of evolution. And she starts by pointing out sort of the key characteristics of the human species that have played key roles in our evolution. And she notes those as tool making, symbolic behavior and language, and the domestication of plants and animals. And what she's arguing in this particular piece is that there's a fourth behavior that is, again, a key defining characteristic of Homo sapiens and is central to our evolutionary path. And that's a characteristic that she refers to as the animal connection. So she's saying this one is a new one that we need to add to that list if we want to understand what is distinctive about humans, and what are the most important elements that informs our evolution. What she means by the animal connection is, what she calls it is, quote, an increasingly intimate and reciprocal set of interactions between animals and humans. So that's partly things like domesticating animals for use as a source of food. But it's also things like keeping animals as for certain kinds of work, or keeping animals as pets, right? So all of those things that are about close ongoing relationships with animals of various sorts. So she suggests, and she provides a lot of evidence for this in the article, that this is an ancient trait, right? That interacting with other species and developing close relationships, lasting relationships with other species, is a thing that is distinctively human. Other animals don't do that in that same way. And she suggests that that particular trait, this trait she calls the animal connection, has had a profound influence on human evolution, and indeed is one of the characteristics that links all those other key characteristics: tool use, symbolic behavior, and domestication. So she's really sort of bringing forth a theory of the centrality of animal-human relationships to our very evolution. You read sort of the article version, but she did also publish a book about this. Incidentally, the other thing you may have noticed about this particular reading is that it's in a journal called Current Anthropology, which has a very interesting sort of way that they present ideas. So there's an initial piece of writing by an author, and then there's commentary, reaction from other specialists in the field, and then a sort of a rebuttal or response from the original author, right? So it gives you a sense, again, that many of these questions that we're talking about in this unit are not settled, or there are sort of working, established ideas that have a lot of sort of importance in the field that people accept as our understanding at that moment, but that there's sort of constantly new ideas being added or ideas being refined. So that's something that we'll find throughout the course, that none of this is done completely in terms of our analysis and thinking. All of this is an ongoing conversation amongst researchers who are trying to sort of ever uncover new elements of the phenomena that they're interested in knowing about. So again, Shipman, I wanted to include this particular set of readings because I think the first two are more on the technical end, right? So you're sort of looking at the specific sites that archaeologists have gone to and what they found, and sort of trying to quantify those meanings. Shipman's article is a little bit more conceptual. Also, of course, is bringing all that specific evidence to bear, but is really thinking about what are the broader implications of these various findings across space and time. So I hope you enjoyed this unit's materials. Again, they're a little different than things we'll be looking at throughout the course, but I think they really provide an important complement on an important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about dogs, and particularly how dogs and animals relate to one another. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.